Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the second part of a two-part webinar on challenges and solutions to keeping parks and public lands from being loved to death. This webinar is hosted by the Institute of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism. I'm Lael Gilbert, Outreach Coordinator. The Institute is a research and extension program at Utah State University, whose mission it is to provide data, information, and knowledge that lead to a better understanding of how to best provide outdoor recreation opportunities. For more information on our research and extension efforts, check out the web address found on the slide. You can also sign up for our weekly e-newsletter that shares new advances in the science and management of outdoor recreation experiences and resources. I'll turn it over now to Jordan Smith, Director of the Institute, to introduce the session.
Thanks, Lael, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Lael mentioned, this is the second part of a webinar on challenges and solutions to keeping our parks and public lands from being loved to death. The first webinar provided a high-level review of what different federal and state agencies are doing to respond to the marked increase in visitation to national parks, state parks, national forests, and other public lands. In that session, we heard from representatives from the Park Service, the Forest Service, as well as the National Association of State Park Directors. And that session is recorded and available on our YouTube page. Today, we're going to dig deeper into the science and management of outdoor recreation behavior. The session today is designed to provide park and protected area managers, nonprofit organizations, user groups, and others with a better understanding of how to manage outdoor recreation, its impacts on the environment, and more importantly, how those impacts can be avoided and mitigated. We'll be hearing from three outstanding recreation ecologists whose work spans the Western US. They're going to talk about their experiences in a variety of different projects that they have across the region in national parks, national forests, and other county lands that provide outdoor recreation opportunities. We'll be hearing from Dr. Chris Mons, Dr. Ashley D'Antonio, and Dr. Abby Cisneros-Kidd. First, I'd like to introduce Chris Mons. Chris is a professor of Recreation Resources Management in the Department of Environment and Society here at Utah State. Chris, it's great to have you on the call today. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Ashley D'Antonio. Ashley is an assistant professor of nature-based recreation management in the College of Forestry and the Department of Forest, Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State. Ashley, thanks for being on the call today. Maybe you can do a quick introduction of yourself.
Yeah, so thanks, Jordan. Yeah, as Jordan said, I'm also a recreation ecologist. I do a lot of work, even though in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of my work is actually all across the West in various national parks and national forests. And I do work focused on how behavior impacts the environment in recreation settings.
Thanks so much, Ashley. And our final panelist today is not too far away from us here in Logan, but represents the kind of the eastern edge of our geographic range of panelists, and is still not too far east. Dr. Abigail Cisneros-Kidd is an assistant professor of outdoor recreation and tourism management at the Haub School of Natural Resources at the University of Wyoming. Abby, it's great to have you on the panel today.
Thanks, Jordan. It's great to be here. I'm also a recreation ecologist, and my work is focused largely on spatial behavior patterns of recreators across landscapes and understanding the drivers of spatial behavior patterns and how to effectively communicate with visitors to change undesirable behaviors such as traveling off trail, off of designated trails. I've also done some research looking at understanding the impacts of recreation and its presence on wildlife in parks and protected areas. And my work has spanned coast to coast. I've worked in Maine, from Maine to Southern California.
Great, thanks, Abby. Well, I'm gonna get us started here with just some procedural overviews and kind of give all of the attendees an idea of what to expect and how they can interact with the panelists. I'll be facilitating the discussion today and making sure that everyone who is in attendance has a chance to ask questions of the panelists. We will be taking those questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. If you want to open that up, you can type your questions in to the panelists. Those will come up and I will make sure that they get asked once we have time for the Q&A. We also will be using the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen to share insights or to share information that you would like to share with all of the other attendees on the call today. So if you don't have your chat open, you can go ahead and open that up. And there's a little to button there that has either all panelists or all panelists and attendees. If you want to go ahead and change that to all panelists and attendees, that will make sure that your comments to the entire group go out to everyone and not just the 5 of us who are panelists on Zoom. So if you have questions of the panelists, you ask those through the Q&A. And if you have any other ideas or insights that you would like to share with everyone on the call today, go ahead and use that chat function. Just to get everyone started and familiar with that chat function and to get an idea of how many people we have on the call today and where they're represented from, if you want to go ahead and type in there what park or protected area that you're most interested, that you've most recently visited. And that will give us an idea of where folks are coming from and the geographic range of people that we have on the call today. So go ahead and type that in, make sure it's set to all panelists and attendees, and then go ahead and hit enter. It looks like we have folks from all over the West, Alaska, Malaysia. That might be the outlier in the group. Most folks around the Intermountain West. So we do have a great group of attendees on the call today. It looks like we have about 134 on right now. So thanks everyone again for joining us today. Chris, I want to get started off with you since that's where we wrapped up with the first conservation conversations discussion. Can you start us off with an overview of what the science says about how outdoor recreation impacts ecological systems and how those impacts and the benefits and how those impacts occur and the benefits and drawbacks to both dispersing and concentrating use, two kind of common approaches that managers use or think about using when they're considering managing the ecological impacts of outdoor recreation. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Let me go ahead and share my screen here so we can get right into the PowerPoint. Okay, I think everybody should be able to see my slides now. Well, thanks for that introduction. Today, what I'd like to talk about is some work that has really framed a lot of the research I've done over the last 20, 25 or more years, and bring that into the conversation so we can all be on the same page of some of the general principles we've learned in recreation ecology studies that have taken place for a long time. So let's dive right into it here. First, recreation ecology is the study of how recreation activities disturb ecological systems. And we might be looking at soil, vegetation, wildlife, water, air quality, any of the elements that we're concerned about protecting in parks and public lands in order to maintain intact ecosystems that are there for the sustainability of those ecosystems and for human visitation. We also look into how human disturbance affects the visitor experience. And so we put this all together in the idea of developing sustainable management strategies that allow visitors a profound nature-based experience, but also protect those ecosystems in a large scale, time scale for future generations. So we'll be addressing a lot of these issues in the discussion today. So way back before I was working in this field, a couple of very esteemed researchers, David Cole and Mike Little from Australia, started putting together some general principles of how humans affect ecosystem properties in the process of recreating in public lands and parks. And they came up with this, what we call these days, a use impact theory. And I wanted to start off here. Those of you that were in the last panel session might have remembered we talked about this a little bit. So as some general principles, many research studies conducted over the years have more or less shown similar responses, looking at the relationship between recreation use and the amount of disturbance or impact. Many ecosystems respond in this curvilinear fashion. And here we're looking at the difference between a more tolerant and maybe a more sensitive ecosystem on the red line. But the point of the matter is that what's profound about this use response function is that the initial disturbance results in the vast majority of the impact. So different ecosystems might proceed a little bit different rate, but still that general principle applies. The second thing that's very profound about this is this part of the curve, in that once the initial impact has been created, additional use results in little additional change in those areas, provided that use is confined to those locations. This use impact relationship has been around a long time, and it's also formed some of the basis for a lot of our management strategies in parks. To look at this in a little more detail, myself and some colleagues from Australia a few years back now started really digging into the contemporary literature and trying to determine whether this use impact relationship theory still applies. And we came up with some interesting findings. First, and we can talk about this in more detail if folks like, there's really more than one use response function. And that it largely depends on the kinds of things you might be interested, whether it's vegetation, soils, wildlife, etc. Oftentimes we can generalize things a little bit differently. However, this common generalization that's been around for a long time, and again, it's depicted right here, really does still apply in many cases. It's still useful. And the responses might be slightly different, like we're seeing here a sigmoidal response, as we might see in some vegetation types. But still this idea that initial use can result in rapid change is a very important one. And the second concept, that we can get to a point where additional use results in no additional disturbance, is the second point that's important. So out of this, we might start to think, well, high use types of situations really require confinement in a spatial fashion in order to reduce overall ecological disturbance. And then the second thing is that if we're trying to do a dispersal strategy, well, that's really only going to be effective if we're way down here on the curve and we manage things very intensively. Let's look at this in a little more detail. Some experimental work that I did a few years ago on Arctic tundra looked at this in a little more of a quantifiable fashion. So here we're looking at applied disturbance in the form of trampling and the response of the ecosystem in terms of vegetation cover disturbance. And comparing two different tundra ecosystems, a dry tundra and a moist tundra, so a more initially resistant and a more susceptible ecosystem. And so we can see that S-shaped curve really has been found in this empirical data, suggesting that there is an awful lot of empirical evidence to support that basic theory of initial disturbance at some point hits a trigger where it changes very rapidly. We can apply this at a number of different kinds of management situation. My colleague Jeff Marion at Virginia Tech and his associates over the years have done a lot of work applying this theory to the site level management of visitor sites like campsites, etc. It's a little bit of a complicated figure, but if we spend a minute and walk through it, I think it'll illustrate this principle really well. Okay, so the blue line, we're looking at the use response function in a theoretical way. And then here on the horizontal axis, we're looking at the amount of use. So in this case, it's nights of camping. On the vertical axis, we're looking at impact, the impact response. So we might start out in a general sense, dispersing visitors. And if we do that and we get good visitor compliance and well-trained people in the field, we might be able to disperse use such that we only get one night of camping on something like 45 sites. If the ecosystem's pretty durable, well, maybe that won't result in all that much of a long-lasting impact. However, what most often happens in unregulated situations and dispersed, quote unquote, camping kind of strategies is we get multiple sites forming with a limited number of use per year. As a consequence, we get a large spatial area of disturbance at a pretty high level on the curve. So in this example, we might have 3 sites, each getting 15 nights of camping per year. If we move towards a confinement strategy, we can reduce the overall aggregate area of disturbance. We may have to close some sites here, but if we can manage visitors such that there's one very desirable campsite that provides excellent camping and manage the use such that 45 nights per year can be confined to that area, we don't see all that much increase in disturbance on that site, and we've reduced the overall aggregate area significantly. So from a site perspective, the application of this theory makes a lot of sense to reduce overall ecological impact. We can also look at this from a very different perspective, and some of the issues we're dealing with in many of our parks today. We'll take a little visit here to Rocky Mountain National Park. I noticed a number of folks on the webinar from Colorado and have been to the park recently. But for those of you that may not have been there recently, it's a great park in Colorado, just proximate to the Front Range, has beautiful iconic peaks and great places to visit. Very popular. It's gotten dramatically popular to visit Rocky in the last 5 to 10 years with major increases in use. So the park brought us in to do some studies there looking at vehicle management. And what they're doing essentially is employing a diversion strategy, a dispersal strategy to move visitors from one very congested part of the park to other parts of the park. And they wanted us to investigate what the effects of that were. Looking in a little more detail, here's Rocky Mountain National Park, a park map. Here's the main entrance to the park where most visitors come through at Beaver Meadows. And here is the intersection with the Bear Lake Road. And the Bear Lake Road is a dead-end road, very scenic, takes visitors up to a high mountain lake, Bear Lake, at about 10,000 feet, where they can access some incredible alpine terrain. It's one of the most popular, if not the most popular location in the entire park. Well, what happens is all these visitors come in and the Bear Lake area gets very congested. The entire roadway gets very crowded. This has been despite various management strategies on part of the park. So what they've decided to do is when this area becomes congested, they put up a vehicle diversion right at the entrance area. What that consists of is park staff turning vehicles away, telling them that the area is full at capacity and that they'll have to enter at another time. So what we did, we were brought in to try to understand, well, what happens to those diverted visitors? Where do they go? How does that potentially affect visitor experience and park resources? So here we are at the diversion, asking visitors to voluntarily participate in a study where we handed out GPS units. and we looked at their behavior in the vehicles before, during, and after the diversion took place. So we did a lot of very complicated spatial statistics on the GPS tracks and looked at the locations and the behaviors that people were exhibiting once they were diverted. I won't get into the detail there. We're in the process of publishing a couple papers on that, but I will cut right to the chase. What we found in this diversion strategy is that a few people did leave the park, but most people dispersed to other areas of the park. And most of those locations saw increases, a significant increase in use. These were previously locations that had less use than they did during the diversion. The visitors that were restricted, in other words, the diverted visitors, drove more, about 30 minutes more on average as they were going around in the park. Ultimately, those visitors were kind of killing time to access Bear Lake, and that most of them eventually were able to get in, either later in the day when the diversion eased up, or after hours when there was no diversion in place. This kind of behavior, if we go back to the use impact curve, use impact theory, suggests a net increase in ecological impacts, or at least the potential for that park-wide. Now we're putting more people into lower used areas, and if we look at things like overall carbon footprint, they're driving around more. Okay, so looking at the ecological data, both some empirical studies, experimental designs, some observational data of visitor behavior, it's suggestive that maybe we ought to be confining visitors to more hardened locations in order to minimize those impacts. The question comes up, would that be acceptable to visitors? Well, I don't have an answer for that fully, but I have some indications. So some work we're currently doing in Orange County, California, in very crowded urban proximate wildland areas suggests that principles of solitude and escape are maybe less important than other kinds of things on the scale, such as exercise and being with friends and family. Now, clearly this is very preliminary and needs to be looked at in more detail. But I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that maybe visitor expectations are starting to change. And we're realizing that when we go to parks and protected areas, we are going to see other people and interact with them. And maybe other things such as being with friends and family and getting exercise are now driving motivations a little bit more. I'm speculating here, but I think this is suggestive of some interesting things for us to think about given our current situation in parks. Okay, so to wrap all this up today, if we think about flying at 30,000 feet and what some of the theory tells us about managing visitors, it suggests that dispersing visitors, particularly in situations that we're in right now, with having to deal with such high use and some rapid change in use in our parks, that's going to tend to increase overall ecological disturbance in parks. Confinement strategies tend to help us limit the overall extent of impact. It's a question whether ideas of solitude that we all think are important still remain so for all visitors and all situations. We certainly need to manage for solitude in many cases, but maybe some situations, such as depicted here on Angel's Landing in Zion, maybe solitude is less important for certain visitors, and we need to think about that in our management strategies. On a park-wide level, management strategies will likely be more effective than a within park level. In Rocky Mountain National Park with the vehicle diversion, we saw that moving visitors from one part of the park to another potentially just increases overall disturbance. Setting capacities at the entrance gate and managing for the indicator of the most crowded areas might be more effective in the long run. Thank you. That's what I have for today.
Thanks, Chris. Now I want to open it up to questions specifically for Chris on his presentation. We've already had a couple that have come in. So just to remind the attendees, if you do have questions for Chris, we'll follow up each of the short presentations by about a 5-minute Q&A session. And then at the end, we'll have a more open discussion to all the panelists. So Chris, some of the questions that have come in have focused on the diversity of use. Krista specifically asks about how this use impact theory and those use impact curves hold up under diverse types of use. She specifically says she's seeing, compound impacts from dogs, horses, bikes, and e-bikes. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Krista, for that question. Good question. Many studies have been done over the years looking at different activity types and their relative level of disturbance. As you might expect, a lot of it is situational in that depending on the type of ecosystem and depending on the specifics of the visitor behavior, the level of proliferation and disturbance can be quite different. As a rule, a very careful minimum impact visitor under many different activity types can minimize their disturbance. Having said that, in general, activities where greater ground forces are created, at least when it comes to soil and vegetation, tend to create more disturbance in the long run. And so it's those kinds of activities that we need to be more careful of. As we move from non-motorized to motorized, that represents other challenges. So there are a lot of variables there, and it's an interesting area to look into. Again, a lot of it is very site specific, but if I were to generalize, I would say those activities that result in greater potential force on the ground surface can result in more impact. We get into wildlife and a whole degree of other situational variables come up. So like, for example, you mentioned dogs, right? And that's a big issue with wildlife, dogs on the leash, dogs off the leash. All of those kinds of variables come into play. So a lot of things to consider.
Thanks, Chris. And we have a couple other questions coming in, and I see also some coming into the chat. Just to remind people, please ask those to the Q&A just so we can keep track of which ones are coming in. Chris, next question is from Kim, who's down in Zion. She brings up this point that there they are seeing that when people are diverted away from the main canyon, they go to the east or west sides of the park, where there's much less in the way of set trails or designated trails, less capacity. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to discuss that a little bit and reinforce that point that you're seeing in your study from Rocky Mountain, and that is a kind of an unintended consequence of restricting the amount of use to very prominent destinations. And maybe if you have some other examples or points or ways that managers can actually address these unintended consequences when limiting access to a very well-known site, and it might be a physical capacity issue where they have to, or by default, use is getting directed to other locations.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. Excellent question. Yeah, clearly Zion is experiencing many of these challenges. So as visitors get pushed to the east side of the park, if there are less hardened surfaces, developed trails, or even just designated routes to confine visitor use, the potential for the increase of disturbance to those areas is significant. So that's exactly that low end of the use impact curve, where if we start to push use into areas that are not currently being used, we'll see rapid changes and the development of areas of disturbance, be them trails or gathering places or sites. So that is a significant challenge. And one of the unintended consequences, as Jordan mentioned, is as we start to reach capacity at our developed areas and have to direct visitors elsewhere, we're potentially creating locations where disturbance is proceeding quite rapidly. So, there are complex problems, and it's going to require fairly complicated solutions. But again, the general principle of confining visitors to hardened surfaces will overall limit impact.
Thanks, Chris. And I have a really good follow-up question. This comes from Brooke Saucer, who I think we both know pretty well. Brooke was a former graduate student here at Utah State and is now up in the Teton Valley. So Brooke asks, recreation is becoming so prominent in people's lives. It's becoming, the demand is increasing so rapidly, and that a lot of communities are starting to consider developing recreation infrastructure as a way to provide those resources to folks locally. For example, within her neck of the woods, locals want many trails in nearby national forests as a way to get away from high traffic areas in Grand Teton. So is there any strategic ways that local communities who are considering developing outdoor recreation infrastructure on either county lands or for agencies like the Forest Service who might be considering developing infrastructure on more urban proximate lands, that they should consider putting in place if they know that the environmental impacts are going to be immediate, and most of those impacts will be realized very early on as the use infiltrates an area?
Yeah, hi Brooke, thanks for that question. Great question. Dovetails a lot into the work we're doing in Orange County, California, which is very urban proximate, and our wildland areas. So I think we do need to develop more urban proximate access for visitors to have a nature-based experience. But I would mention that experience might be fundamentally different than we think of in terms of some of our more remote parks and protected areas and wilderness areas. Visitors may very well accept a little bit more crowding, more infrastructure development, more hardened surfaces. And I think those are very appropriate, because those will be the ways that we can, again, confine visitors to those areas that we manage, that we plan for, and are constructed to support their activities in a way that will not result in more disturbance in the long run. Accommodating those folks close to home provides those valuable nature-based experiences that we all need and desire. And so I think obviously with COVID, this become even more important to us as park and protected area professionals to start thinking in those terms. I hope that helps answer your question.
Thanks, Chris. We have a couple questions talking about the ways that capacity can be measured within parks and protected areas. And I know this is a common question that comes up for park managers, and maybe you could just briefly talk about the different ways that it can be measured and the ways that it's often used to control or limit use to particular areas.
Yeah, capacity is a difficult concept. We've been working with that in parks and protected areas for 30 years or more now. I think initially we thought we had the solution to it, but now we're seeing some of the complexities. There have been a couple of ways over the years that has been investigated, and by no means do I feel like we've got a silver bullet here. The first is to try to determine indices of crowding and when people feel crowded. There's a whole line of research that has gone into doing that using various kinds of methods, social science methods. That is a very good way to approach it. The problem with that is a moving baseline, and that what we've seen with some historical studies that What visitors once thought was crowded and unacceptable is now perfectly normal, right? So that's an issue. A second way that we oftentimes look into capacity is facility capacity. And that's really what's driving the issue in Rocky Mountain National Park. Issues of safety and facility infrastructure capacity. Now that's a double-edged sword because oftentimes that might be affecting resources and social conditions downstream in a way that we're not that happy with, but is a good driving variable because we have to think of visitor safety and those kinds of issues as paramount. So I don't have a good general answer for that question other than to suggest that, again, getting the most information about visitors, facilities, ecological conditions to make those decisions are very important.
Thanks, Chris. And I think that transitions us really well into what Ashley will be talking about relating to spatially and temporally zoning folks within visitors to parks and protected areas. So I wonder if we can start off with a prompt to get everyone thinking about this idea of a common, well, I don't know if it's too common, Ashley, but it is a very tried and true method to try to limit conflict and to reduce the amount of environmental degradation that's happening in parks and protected areas. So we have this prompt in the chat if you want to go ahead and answer it. The question is, have you ever visited a park or protected area that used a zoning approach to manage visitors? And if so, where was that zoning approach used? So go ahead and type that into the chat and go ahead and hit enter, and that will give Ashley a better idea of kind of the examples that you're familiar with.
Great. Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, and an idea there is just to, as I'm going through my presentation, I offer a couple examples, but there's a lot of great knowledge out there of other places that use zoning approaches. So, I'm sharing my screen, so I'll check into the chat after my presentation to see the other great examples that folks had. Are we all good? Can you see my share screen and presentation? Fine?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Great, thanks, Jordan. So as Jordan said, I'm going to talk about zoning as another management tool that can be used to help manage both social and ecological impacts from outdoor recreation. And I was looking for examples of maps that were illustrating zoning, and I found this great publicly available map from the White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona, illustrating both a spatial and temporal zoning that they do on the lands that they manage, which they allow the public to hunt during certain times of the year. Certain areas that are highlighted in this green are only open to tribal members. Other areas are closed year-round. Other areas are open part of the year. And so this is just a map to kind of get us thinking about what zoning can look like on a landscape. And this is a really good illustration of what temporal zoning can look like as well. And I will have a number of maps, and I know in the Zoom environment, sharing these on a small screen can be difficult to see. So I'll try and highlight as much as I can the areas that I'm pointing out when I do show maps. So a little bit of background about zoning and how it can be a useful management tool. So there's various factors that can influence the level of social or ecological impact that we might see to a park or protected area for recreation use. There's a number of these factors. A lot of these we can measure, and we have a lot of management tools for many of these factors that can influence social and ecological impact. But I think zoning can be really helpful for managing and thinking about two types of factors that, again, influence how much impact and the extent of the impact that we see. And that is the timing of visitor use and the location of visitor use. So again, zoning can help us control or manage where and when people recreate on a landscape. So I'm going to start with a basic definition of zoning and then work through a couple examples and then wrap up with questions, as Jordan said, just like we did for Chris. So at its most basic definition, zoning is distributing or separating recreational activities or uses across space or time, okay? So it can be spatial zoning, where we have people allowed to use different parts of a protected area and not others maybe, or time, where certain times of the year certain recreational activities are allowed or not. And oftentimes zonings are paired with other sorts of restrictions around use, and I will have a couple examples of that. Here in Corvallis, Oregon, we have a research forest where recreation is permitted that we manage just outside of town. I live really close to it, and we use a spatial and temporal zoning approach approach on our trail systems. So here, again, I know it's a little hard to see, so I'll point it out. Trails that are in red, we are permitted to have hiking, biking, or horse use on this trail, on these trails year round. Some of our other trails, like these trails in orange that you can see on kind of the northeast edge of this map, they allow hiking year round and seasonal biking use. But during certain times of the year, in the wet winters here in Oregon, because wet trails can be more impacted by mountain bike use, we don't permit mountain biking during the wet season. And then some trails in blue, which is the bulk of this map, those are permitted to have hiking only allowed, so no bike use regardless of the time of the year, and no equestrian use, but hiking is allowed year round. And so that's an example of a combination of using both spatial zoning for the trail system and temporal zoning with mountain biking use. Often, zoning approaches can be used to manage a variety of different types of impacts or issues that we may have. So zoning can be used to manage crowding. It's very commonly used to manage conflict, and I'll have an example of that today for you. It can be used to help manage competing uses, and can also be used to protect ecologically sensitive areas, and I'll present an example of that as well from some of my own research. Zoning can work for terrestrial parks and protected areas or aquatic. Zoning is actually super common in marine protected areas. So Great Barrier Reef has a zoning system. And so here's just a generic illustration of what zoning in an aquatic protected area looks like. But I did just kind of want to mention this briefly, since it is a pretty popular management technique, where you may have no areas where no recreation use is allowed, all the way up to areas where there could be commercial permits or commercial use allowed. And so this idea of how to zone recreation use in space and time, I'll give you a lot of terrestrial examples today, but it does apply to aquatic systems. So many of you, I know someone, I think it was Keith in the Q&A, mentioned ROS. So the recreation opportunity spectrum is kind of your classic example of a management tool focused on zoning. And for folks that might not know, the ROS was developed by the Forest Service, and the idea was to be able to zone for different recreational opportunities across the landscape. And this overall zoning approach recognizes that diverse opportunities can exist and coexist within any given recreation landscape, and that the motivations that people have and the benefits they're hoping to achieve through outdoor recreation might vary, but we can zone for those different opportunities. ROS is used as a management tool, but it was also originally thought of as it could be a planning framework. We have other planning frameworks available to us now, but I do want to just recognize that it can be used as a planning framework in addition to being a zoning tool. So the goal of ROS, which I briefly explained, but just to kind of put the text up there so you can see it, is to provide opportunities for visitors to participate in their preferred activities, and by hopefully creating different zones based on what visitors might hope to achieve, we can provide those quality experiences and reduce conflict across these landscapes. And the idea of zoning is based on the idea that any recreation setting has both physical characteristics in the natural environment, there's a social setting component, and we also have a managerial setting component that we want to think about. So, you know, the facilities and things that we can provide visitors. And the overall kind of equation of ROS is that if we think about setting and activity combined and how we manage those, we can create and manage for different experiences for visitors. This is your classic ROS spectrum of recreational opportunities. And so this is from the Forest Service ROS primer. And I put the names of the different zones that were originally conceived for ROS here on the bottom. But it's basically illustrating that we can manage 4 different experiences, all the way from primitive experiences when we think about, you know, designated wilderness type experiences, all the way to more urban or urban proximate type experiences that visitors may seek. So again, ROS is kind of a classic example of zoning. And as I move through this, I'm going to provide some more examples of research projects that have looked at zoning to protect certain resources or to reduce conflict. So I'm going to first give you an example. This is not my research. I put the citation here, but I really like this example and really like the study that was done. So this is a study by Miller and colleagues that was done in 2017. This is in the Vail Pass Winter Recreation Area. And in this area, it's really popular for both motorized and non-motorized winter recreation, so snowmobiling and cross-country skiing and snowshoeing. In order to reduce conflict in this area, what has been done is that the Forest Service has created zones here in blue that are open to motorized recreation, and then areas in green that are closed to motorized recreation but opened to non-motorized recreation. So again, this is wintered recreation, so we're thinking here in the blue we'd see snowmobiles and other sorts of motorized winter recreation, and then in the green we'd have our non-motorized recreation happening. The hashed areas are locations where it's mixed use, so where there is a little bit of overlap, and that's mostly because of transitions between zones or because of trailheads. So what the researchers did, and this is a technique that actually Chris, Abby, and I all use in our research, is to GPS track the visitors as they were out there recreating in this landscape in the winter. So they're given GPS units to take with them when they were on their snowmobiles or on their skis, and we looked to see where they were going. And so what these researchers found was that in general, and I know, again, sorry about the maps, it's such a struggle in Zoom, but areas in orange are different levels of motorized use. The darker the orange, the more motorized use is there. Areas in this purple are different kinds of non-motorized use. The darker the purple, the more non-motorized use. And again, this is skiing generally. So what they found here is that this zoned system was working for creating, limiting the spatial overlap between motorized and non-motorized recreationists. And again, the goal here was to reduce conflict between these two often competing types of recreation uses. However, in those hashed areas that I showed on the first map, there was really high use in those locations. And so even though there was relatively small spatial overlap, where that spatial overlap occurred, use was high. And so part of the study was to try and figure out why, despite this great zoning system, there continued to be some conflict between these different user groups, again, despite putting in the zoning and people generally complying with it. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but this combination of where overlap was happening, use was high, was resulting in some persistent conflict between these user groups. So the point here is, here's a great way of thinking about zoning, but there are some limitations to zoning as a management tool. And as I get to the end, I'll come back to this and talk about some recommendations that these authors have and suggestions that I have of how this could have been improved. So the second case study example I'm going to provide, I'm going to take you to the Pacific Northwest for a minute with me for a study that I worked on looking at a project to evaluate zoning to protect wildlife. I also really like this study because I rarely get to put really cute pictures in my presentations, and the species of wildlife is adorable. So this was a study in Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area, which is along the coast of Oregon, managed by Siuslaw National Forest. It is a mixed-use recreation destination, so there is ATV and OHV use on some of these beaches and in the dunes. There's also a lot of hiking that occurs. That's already zoned, so there's generally some trails where hiking is allowed and non-motorized recreation is allowed, and beaches where non-motorized recreation is allowed, and then motorized specific beaches and motorized specific trails. So we already have some zoning happening. But during part of the year, the western snowy plover migrates to this area and nests and raises their young in the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area beaches. And in 1993, the Pacific Coast population of this species was listed as threatened. So what the Siuslaw National Forest has done is to overlay a second wildlife-focused approach to zoning on top of their already existing zoning to separate motorized and non-motorized recreation. And so for part of the year, so we've got a temporal component here as well, for part of the year between March and September, additional beaches are closed to motorized recreation, and non-motorized recreation can only be permitted on areas where the sand is wet. So this is an interesting example, because the zones, the area that you want to allow recreation to occur, actually moves with the tide lines. So what we came in to do here is to look at compliance with this zoning. So we were looking to make sure folks were complying with the motorized, non-motorized recreation separation, and that they were complying with this kind of transient zones of where the sand is wet to keep folks away from the areas that the snowy plover uses. And so in this case, this beach that I show here in this image is a non-motorized recreation beach. So we were looking to make sure that folks out there were not coming with ATVs or OHVs. We are also looking to make sure they're not coming with dogs. That's another thing that happens when seasonally dogs are not allowed on these beaches. And so we'd be watching for those. But then if individuals came and were complying with the no dog regulation and were non-motorized recreationists, we'd want to ensure that they were hiking along the beach or using the beach in the areas where the sand is wet. Everything up here is not permitted during snowy plover nesting season for recreation use. So you can see these footprints in the sand. That person would have been out of compliance for a little bit of time. So my favorite tool to study visitor behavior is GPS tracking, but that doesn't work really well when the tide line is changing the zones a little bit, and when we don't necessarily have really clear entry points for visitors on these beaches. So we did unobtrusive observations and kind of sat in the beach dunes and looked at where people were going and looked at what they were doing to look at how they were complying with these different zoning restrictions. And so what we found via our unobtrusive observations was that generally on one of our sites, visitors were not compliant 44% of the time when they headed north on the beach, but not compliant only 21% of the time when they headed south. So there was this kind of spatial thing happening. I can explain that more if you're interested. On our busier location where we did this study, we found that non-compliance, about half of visitors were not complying with the zoning regulations close to the trailhead, but the further they got away from the trailhead, we had greater compliance. One other thing I want to point out about zoning that this study looked at as well is whether or not managers support this management action. And generally, research has shown that overall visitors to various different types of protected areas are pretty supportive of zoning as a management tool. And we saw that in the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area as well. You know, visitors were pretty supportive of education, which Abby's actually going to talk about next. They were supportive of direct management actions such as fencing to close off areas and to separate the different zones. And they also were pretty supportive of restricting use on the wet sand, which again was one of the zoning strategies that the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area was using. So key findings, when zones were delineated with fencing and more direct management techniques, we had really high compliance. We still had pretty good compliance with the overall zoning of not having dogs in these beaches, not having motorized use, and generally folks knew where to walk, but not as high of compliance as with the fencing. And that we did have some signage out here as well, and Abby again will talk more about signage and other types of outreach, but visitors didn't really engage with that very much. So to kind of wrap up these couple of case studies to talk about some limitations and opportunities related to zoning. So in both the case studies I presented, the one looking at zoning for conflict and the study of Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area, there needs to be some often paired with some sort of other active management. So maybe that can be volunteers communicating the zoning strategy. Maybe that is going out to the groups that might be in conflict, like the non-motorized and motorized recreationists, and working with them to explain why the zoning is in place to ensure compliance. Again, effective messaging can be key. I'm not going to talk too much about that. That's Abby's topic. We also want to consider equity implications. So one of this recommendations with the Vail area study was to overlay on top of the spatial zoning a temporal zoning, so that you could also separate the motorized and non-motorized recreation in time, so we wouldn't have these issues at trailheads or overlaps. But you want to be careful about that, right? If you're only allowing motorized recreationists to maybe be there on the weekends, then that might create some inequities around folks who have more flexibility during the week to be able to leave their job or to work from home to be able to get out in those places. So with any of these management techniques, you want to be thinking about equity and social justice, and are you creating any inequities in the ways that you are implementing management? And that applies to zoning as well. From an opportunities perspective with zoning, it's generally supported by visitors, pretty supportive of these techniques, even when there's restrictions tied to them, right? It can be really powerful if you're able to combine spatial and temporal approaches, especially when you think about conflict. If you can separate groups in space and in time, that can be less of an overlap or competition between groups that may be in conflict or user types that may be in conflict. And as I mentioned early on, these zoning approaches can be applied to winter recreation, different types of activities, terrestrial and marine systems. And so zoning can be a tool that can apply across a variety of different recreational systems, trails or beaches. So it can be pretty powerful from that standpoint. So that was your quick introduction to zoning and a few examples. That's all I have for my presentations, and I think we'll have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ashley. And just to remind everyone, if you do have questions specific to Ashley's presentation, go ahead and get those asked in the Q&A, and we'll get them asked of Ashley. I wanted to start off with one question that you briefly talked about in your implications, Ashley, was about the need for continual or strong enforcement to really make zoning work. There's a lot of locations around the West where on federally managed recreation areas where there's very limited ability to enforce these types of zoning solutions. Is there opportunities to make zoning work in those types of locations where it can't be explicitly or managed through law enforcement from an agency? And I'm thinking particularly about the ways that it's implemented, or the way that it's been successful in a lot of national forests, particularly urban proximate forest, where there almost seems to be a strong social norm and a willingness to adopt some self-policing or policing of other groups because those zoning rules are in place. And if one person has to abide by them, or if you have to abide by them, you're going to make sure that everybody else does. So maybe you could speak to the ways that zoning can be effective, even though there might not be the actual funding to make it implemented or to enforce it through law enforcement.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, I mentioned like some active management, but it doesn't necessarily need to be law enforcement. So in Oregon Dunes, they have an active volunteer group. That is a large, very skinny protected area, and law enforcement has a hard time being able to monitor all of those beaches. And so if you have the capacity, or a friends group, again, that doesn't always work with really remote areas, but friends groups can help with the education and outreach and reminders. You know, they're not going to ticket anyone. You don't necessarily want to do that anyways, but they can kind of help educate people about the zoning and help with compliance, and at least give an indicator of like how compliant people are. I think also connecting with the recreationists and their groups. So here at the research forest, where we use zoning on our trails, our recreation manager works really closely with the equestrian group, and as well as with the dog walking group and the mountain biking organization, Team Dirt. And they work with individuals within those organizations to help communicate these zoned restrictions to their user groups to kind of help with enforcement and set up the norms. Like Team Dirt like reminds their mountain bikers here, like, hey, seasonal closures are in place, don't be riding on the forest trails. We want to keep them in good shape so they're ready to ride in the spring. So that can be another way, if you can't physically be on the landscape, to enforce, using your resources of volunteers or friends groups or key personnel within those user groups can be helpful.
Thanks, Ashley. Next question is about the different levels of compliance and whether or not that is related to the specific reason for zoning to be put in place. And you brought up a good range of examples where zoning can be put in place to either preserve the recreational experience, or in the case of the shorebirds, it can be put in place to preserve the nesting habitat for those particular species. So is there any research or evidence that it's more likely to be effective, or people are more likely to comply when the objective is to preserve the environment, or to conserve a particular species, as opposed to conserving others' experience on public lands?
Yeah, I can't think of any studies off the top of my head, but Chris and Abby should jump in if they know of any. But with any management action, explaining the why behind it can be more effective than just like putting the zoning out there. So, you know, for Oregon dunes, there's lots of information about like the plover biology and why the wet sand or why the dry sand is so important to them, and their different life stages. And that was really helpful. And even though visitors didn't engage with the signs, when one of our other survey questions asked visitors, like, did they know that like it was worded more nicely than this, but like, did they know that recreation impacts the plovers? And most visitors knew that. The thing with, and I'm thinking about closures for like peregrine falcons as well. The thing with these threatened species though is like any amount of non-compliance could result in a loss of an individual for that population. So, you know, even though in the example we showed like, you know, in some sites compliance was pretty good, in the case of these threatened and endangered species, any bit of non-compliance, like in this case, could result in a chick getting stepped on or dying of hypothermia. So I don't know if that completely answered your questions, but I feel like if visitors know why, they might be more likely to comply regardless. And I don't know necessarily of any studies that show compliance is higher with like wildlife-related zoning versus conflict-related zoning.
Thanks, Ashley. There's a couple questions coming in, both on the Q&A and on the chat about the different levels of compliance that you had seen in that the Oregon Dunes study, and why there was a difference in complying going one direction as opposed to the other.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way the coastal system works and the way the trails into these dunes work, you have, I mean, the tough part is you have to cross the dry sand to get to the wet sand. And so depending upon the spatial configuration of where the trail would kind of connect to the beach over the dunes, sometimes it was easier for visitors to head straight to the wet sand and kind of walk there. It also was because visitors who were like lugging a bunch of stuff to kind of hang out, you don't really want to sit on wet sand, right? So visitors that were staying close to their trailhead because they brought their coolers or whatever, they were less likely to comply. But visitors that were moving further or going in different directions, if they were more frequently to be walking along the beach and more likely to get to the wet sand and walk along the wet sand for the duration of their stay. So it's kind of a combination here of even your non-motorized recreationists were engaging in different activity types. And so that was definitely part of it, and the spatial configuration of where the trails connected to the beach systems.
Thanks, Ashley. That makes a lot of sense and helps clarify that. So we've talked now about some of the ecological impacts of concentration versus dispersal of recreationists. Ashley talked about zoning when highlighted some specific examples. Wanted to now to get into the importance of effective communication, and Abby's going to speak to us about that. And to start off, we have a poll that's going to set up Abby's presentation. And Lael, can you launch that poll? The question in the poll that's going to pop up is, what communication methods or strategies would you use to encourage visitors to stay on the designated trail while hiking? So in a very generic example that you can think of, let me go ahead and launch this poll. All right, so you should have that poll pop up. And the question again is, which of the following communication methods is the most effective at keeping visitors on trail? And your options are a sign that describes the ecological benefits of staying on the trail, a sign that describes the benefits of the visitor experience of staying on the trail, and trail markers such as blazes, cairns. And maybe we lost that final answer, that the final response there, but trail markers such as blazes, trail cairns, and signs. We'll give people a few more seconds to get their poll response in. And I think everyone can see those responses as they come in. Abby, can you see those?
I cannot.
Okay, I will end the poll. It looks like I will end the poll. It looks like the results should be shared with you now.
There we go.
And we have about 41% with saying that the most effective communication strategy would be a sign that describes the ecological benefits, and about 40% say the most effective strategy would be trail markers. So Abby, I will let you take it away and talk about those different solutions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jordan, and thank you everyone for being here with us today. So as Jordan mentioned, and as you saw in the poll and other panelists have mentioned, I'm going to be sharing with you about effectively communicating with park and protected area visitors and looking at some best practices there. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Wyoming, where I work, and the surrounding lands where, especially the surrounding public lands where I do a lot of my own research and personal recreation, occupy the ancestral and traditional lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and Shoshone indigenous peoples, along with other native tribes who call the Great Basin and Rocky Mountain region home. So getting into communication and effective communication with visitors, I want to start by talking about, well, what do we communicate with visitors for? So this is likely a recap for many of you, but oftentimes when we're communicating with visitors, we're trying to provide information, things like rules and regulations and closures, interpretation and education, as well as trying to change visitor behavior. So as you saw in Ashley's presentation when she presented that image about the different components that can influence social and ecological impacts on a landscape, one thing that showed up was visitor behavior. So oftentimes visitor behavior results in undesirable impacts on the landscape, and we want to go about changing those behaviors so as to minimize those impacts. So how do we communicate with visitors? We have pre-visit communication that we engage with in terms of things like websites, billboards and advertisements, social media, before visitors arrive at a park and protected area. And we also have communication that we engage with during a visit. So this is where we often see interaction with visitors with staff or volunteers, brochures and maps, kiosks, displays, and of course, signage. So Ashley mentioned that she kind of hinted that I would be talking a bit about signage, and I will be talking about signage today and the effectiveness of using signage specifically to try to change undesirable visitor behaviors. So that gets into how should we communicate with visitors? What are effective practices? Specifically, when we're talking about trying to change visitors' behavior, we need to think about not only what we say, but how we say it. And so I'm going to go through some research and kind of theory that informs what we say and how we say it, as well as a couple specific research examples, including one of my own that I'll share with you today. And I'll get back to that poll result, I promise, at some point here. So when we're thinking about what we say, communication theory and social psychology has informed a lot of good best practices in terms of messaging. So we have things like the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion that's been utilized to help inform behavioral prompts and the use of persuasion when we're communicating with visitors. The theory of planned behavior, this might be a theory that you're familiar with. It's one that I work with really regularly, and I see a lot in the recreation literature as well. But that particular theory has informed addressing attitudes and beliefs as well as norms to help change visitor behavior. There's been a lot of work in kind of more largely pro-environmental behaviors and pro-environmental behavior change, looking at norm activation, and some of this has also spilled into the recreation literature, but activating norms can be an important way to change people's behaviors towards more desirable behaviors. And then the use of pre versus proscriptive, language. So informing visitors of what we do want them to do, as opposed to what we don't want them to do can help move us towards having visitors engage in the desired behaviors. And then the use of attributional language can help give visitors a sense of agency. So using the words you and your, and providing visitors with a sense of that they are capable and are in control of engaging in those behaviors is important as well. And then visual communication and composition theory, and this relates specifically to anything that visitors are going to see and engage with in terms of messaging. So things like signage, kiosks, brochures can inform how well received a message is and if a visitor actually engages with a message. So when you're utilizing good visual composition, and then visitors are more able to engage and more willing to engage with that message. So here I have an example from research done in Petrified Forest National Park. It's a little bit dated at this point, it's back in 2003, but I really like the example. And researchers here were trying to understand how to minimize visitor theft of petrified wood from the park. So they utilized 3 different treatments, one of which is the sign that you see, one is a signed pledge, and then one was a volunteer, to see how effective those treatments were at getting people to not steal wood. And you can see from the sign that they used here, these researchers utilized a lot of these components that I was talking about relative to communication theory and social psychology. You can see this attributional language, you can see highlighting what you want people to do, saying that 99% of all park visitors do not steal petrified wood. That's also activating a norm of not stealing. So there's a lot of good stuff going on in this sign. And as a result, this sign did help minimize the visitor theft of petrified wood. So it was an effective treatment in this case. So signs can be effective. How we say it is also really, really important. So not just what we say, but how we say it can influence the effectiveness of our communication and our message. Context, as you can imagine, is really, really important. So when and where we say things makes a difference, right? So providing rules and regulations at a trailhead, even prior to a visit on park and protected area websites, at visitor centers, so that visitors have a realistic chance of being able to internalize that information and act on it is really important. Also, thinking about context of where signs are placed. Are they actually placed in a way in a spot where visitors are going to be able to see and engage with them? So are your signs actually visible? Is your message visible? Is an important consideration. That kind of falls under this idea of context. Norms are also, they can be really tricky. So when you are working to activate a norm activation can be really powerful in terms of getting people to change behaviors, but you have to be really careful because there's a lot of different stuff going on with norms. And you can actually result in some conflicting messages when you don't have norm alignment. So when we think about norms, we think about kind of general rules of society, rules of engagement, right? So those are our injunctive norms. Our societal norms are things that say, you know, what we should do in a given situation. For example, at a park and protected area that allows dogs, you should pick up after your dog if it poops. You should clean that up and dispose of that properly. However, at many locations, you have descriptive norms. So these are kind of specific locational norms of what people are actually doing on the ground. And if the descriptive norms are not in alignment with the societal, the injunctive norms of what you should do, you can end up seeing a reduced effectiveness of that normative effort to change behavior. So going back to our dog poop example, if you have people who are picking up their dog poop, but then leaving it in a bag tied by the side of the trail, how many people have seen that all the time? Then you can end up with a conflict, right? So people know that they're supposed to pick up after their dog. Maybe they saw a sign saying pick up after their dog, but they're seeing all along the trail evidence of people doing something different. So oftentimes people will engage with that descriptive norm instead of doing what they know that they should do. So making sure those two things are in alignment is really important for norms to be successful. The modality is also really important when we're talking about effectiveness. So Ashley talked about in her presentation that signs were not necessarily, people weren't necessarily engaging with the signs in her work at the dunes. Personal contact can be a really effective way to get people to engage with the message. And then you also have to think about digital and social media, right? And when we're thinking about use of digital and social media, which has become more and more popular in this day and age, you have to consider who your followers are and what message makes sense for those followers. For example, I have an image up here of an Instagram post from Yellowstone National Park. And this image is, this message is great. It says, full can, please take your trash with you. However, many people follow social media accounts of parks and protected areas that they've been to and they value and they already like. So you're seeing this message. This might be a great reminder for folks who have already visited Yellowstone and already value and want to protect that place. But if this message is intended to reach new visitors and people who are coming to the park for the first time, it might not be reaching those people because those people may not be following that social media account yet. So you have kind of specifically on social media an echo chamber kind of effect that can happen. So thinking through and understanding who your followers, who your audience is critical for any type of effective communication, but especially it's important to consider in the digital and social media environment as well. So I want to get into really quickly an example from Acadia National Park and some work that I've done looking at effectiveness of different types of messaging there. And this ties back to our poll question that we got at. So I hope they'll give you an answer there. So in this study, we were looking at the influence of minimum impact education on visitor behavior. And specifically, we were looking at how effective different treatments were at minimizing off-trail travel on Sargent Mountain in Acadia National Park. So Sargent Mountain is the second highest peak next to Cadillac Mountain in Acadia. And when you get up to the summit, as you can see in this image, it turns from a forested environment to this subalpine environment where people have the opportunity to disperse across the landscape. So we wanted to see which of the following treatments versus a control were most effective at getting people to stay on the designated trail. We looked at an ecological sign, which is the sign A that you can see here. So a plea for visitors to stay on trail to benefit the ecosystem in Acadia. Sign B was our amenity sign, which was a plea to visitors to stay on trail because it would result in a better experience for them. And then our control here was the existing trail markers above tree line, which are blue paint blazes and Bates cairns. We also utilized a personal contact, which was not a response that I gave you in the poll. And I'll get to that here in just a minute as well to look at the effectiveness. So many of you said that the ecological based sign would be the most effective. And what we found was that personal contact reduced off-trail behavior the most. And unfortunately, neither of our signs were more effective than the control treatment of just the existing trail markers above tree line. So we wanted to get into a little bit of why. Why was this the case? Why did our signs fail so badly here? Because we know from previous research that signs can be an effective way to change visitor behavior and to get people to engage with communication and messaging that we're providing. So there were a couple reasons in this case. One was poor placement. So our context of our sign was off. We chose to place the signs at the point of choice. So point of choice is the spot where visitors have the opportunity to engage or not engage with the desired or undesired behavior. In this case, the ability to go off trail. So in Acadia on Sargent Mountain, there's a point at which the ecosystem changes from a forested ecosystem to kind of the subalpine, more open ecosystem where you have the chance to disperse. And that's where we wanted to place our signs, because some existing research suggests that signage at the point of choice is more effective than, say, a signage at the trailhead. But this particular location happened to be in one of those steepest sections of the trail, because remember, we're looking at trails going up Sargent Mountain. So we're climbing a mountain in this case, and the signs were placed at a very steep section. And when we asked visitors, because there was we used paired GPS tracking and visitor surveys here, when we asked people if they saw our signs, more than half of people did not even see our signs. So we know our signs were poorly placed, and that could have definitely impacted the effectiveness of our signs. Also, we didn't take into account visitor motivations, which is really important to consider when you're messaging and speaking and communicating with visitors. So in Acadia, visitors are actually allowed to harvest lowbush blueberry. And in order to do that, you would likely need to get off of the designated trail. And many visitors were motivated to pick blueberries during their visit. So not understanding that many people were engaging in this behavior that is sanctioned absolutely impacted the effectiveness of our signage. So I want to talk a little bit about limitations and opportunities for more effective communication, and then I'll leave you with some best practices for communication. So changing behavior with signs, if you haven't already gleaned from the examples that I provided as well as Ashley's discussion, changing behavior with signs is difficult. It's not impossible, but they have to be really, really well designed. They have to be placed just right. Using signs as one of several methods to change behavior is much more effective than using signage alone. So for example, if you're trying to keep visitors on a designated trail, using signs in conjunction with physical barriers preventing people from going off trail is much more effective than using signage on its own. Also, having people on site to communicate to visitors, I understand, is challenging. So that personal contact was really effective at keeping people on trail, but you have to pay staff members to be there. Everyone is short-staffed as it is and stretched thin, but volunteers are really great tools, and many programs already exist to help communicate with visitors. So 2 examples that I provided, and Ashley provided an example at Oregon Dunes as well of the volunteers that they utilize, but summit stewards in the Adirondacks communicate with people visiting mountain summits, and then in Grand Teton National Park, the Wildlife Brigade is a group of volunteers that helps to manage recreation and wildlife interactions on and near roadways in the park. And then social media tends to reach people who already value or like a place, so it's really important to consider and think about how do you reach beyond your followers, and knowing who those followers are, knowing who that audience is in attempting to use social media for behavioral change. Opportunities, we have great opportunities to improve diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility with good communication. So thinking about the influx of visitors that many parks and protected areas have experienced with the COVID-19 pandemic, providing some information about rules and norms for new recreators is really, really important to establish how to engage and the rules of conduct at a specific area. Providing communication in multiple languages is really important. And even beyond that, there's a lot that can be done with just symbology to help provide information to people that is universal. But as recreation, as we're seeing the recreating population in many parks and protected areas, not just areas that see international visitors, but areas throughout the United States, seeing a greater diversity, communicating in multiple languages is an important thing to do. And utilizing volunteers and trail stewards can help with these tasks of communicating in multiple languages in reaching new recreators and helping establish those norms for an area so that we're seeing people engaging in the behaviors we want to see. And then reaching visitors at the planning stage is important. Know before you go campaigns have been really effective at helping with reaching visitors at the planning stage. But doing that can be challenging, especially if we're trying to do it in a digital format. So recent research from 2019 of Wyoming state parks visitors suggested that 65% of visitors got their information about a park either from previous experience visiting or from word of mouth, and only 23% utilized park website and or social media, whether that was the official park's social media or friends' social media to get information. So just understanding the limitations and again, the audience that is utilizing different resources is important for effective communication. And then utilizing theory and research-based practices can boost the effectiveness of communication as well. So as I said, I was going to leave you with some best practices for effective communication. And this is a flyer from Yellowstone that I received on a visit there a couple of years back that made me chuckle. And so I thought I'd share it with you. Knowing your audience is really important. So anyone out there who is an interpreter, you know this, and including your audience in message development when at all possible is really effective at getting community buy-in for that message and compliance. Keeping messages clear and concise, choosing language carefully and using theory and research to inform messaging can lead to more effective behavioral change as through messaging. Making sure people have multiple opportunities to engage with the message. So one message at the point of choice that people may or may not see is not necessarily the most effective way to communicate the behavior that you want to see. So giving people multiple opportunities to engage with the message is more effective in changing behavior. And just remembering that people pay attention to people. It's not always feasible to utilize people or volunteers or staff to interact with people, but people do tend to engage with other people, and that mode of communication is very effective for changing behavior. And a little humor goes a long way. And that's what I have today. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and take a look at the chat and see what's been going on there.
Great, thanks, Abby. Lots of good questions coming in, and if you do have a question that you want Abby to address, get it asked in the Q&A. Abby, one that just came in was focused on this realization, and you briefly talked about it, was that outdoor recreation has increased dramatically during the pandemic, and most of those outdoor recreationists, we believe, they're now participating are first-time users. Is there any specific strategies or methods that are likely to resonate with that new audience?
Yeah, Jordan, that's a great question. Thanks for sharing that. I'd like to say, yes, there's this magic cure-all, this perfect one way to interact with this user group, but oftentimes the best response is going to be location specific. And I talked about understanding your audience and understanding, who these new visitors are. Not all new visitors are the same. You can see a lot of difference between a new person who is new to an area, who is hiking and exploring an area, versus somebody who's new to backcountry skiing, who's accessing an area for a first time. Those differences in activity types and those different types of user groups come with different challenges in communication and the types of behaviors that we're interested in as well. So I'm not trying to dodge the answer, but it really is context and location specific in terms of what the best practices are.
And so, Abby, maybe a follow-up question to that is a lot of corporate efforts during the pandemic have been focused on trying to entice individuals to recreate responsibly. Mm-hmm. And that was a big campaign that was pushed, I believe, originally by REI, and it has gotten shared very widely through a whole bunch of different social media influencers and different state offices of outdoor recreation who engage in that type of outreach engagement type of work. Do you think those types of campaigns, when they're directed and disseminated through social media, are really effective at mitigating these impacts on the ground, or is that just one tool in effectively trying to reach visitors?
I think it's a tool. It's one tool in effectively reaching visitors. And so a lot of the Recreate Responsibly campaign, a lot of the material that I've seen provides kind of some information on what to do. But as Ashley mentioned in her presentation, it doesn't necessarily provide the background of why you want to do that. So providing that level of information as well, not just here's what you do to recreate responsibly, but background as to why you want to recreate responsibly can get people more on board and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's not just this blanket rule, like do this without any explanation. Providing that explanation and that background can also be really helpful. And then when you're talking about social media and influencers, right, I could get into the elaboration and likelihood model of persuasion here that talks about getting people to change behaviors versus using a couple different routes. So you can try to get people to internalize and say, yeah, I want to do this behavior because it's the right thing to do. And I'm educated about why to do that. And I'm going to make that informed decision and engage in that behavior. In the short term, if you want just a quick communication, you can also attach that message to a personality or someone that that people believe and would follow without any additional information. So you get into kind of the nitty gritty there of ways that you can utilize social media to change behavior. And either way, you're going to want to attach something more than just how to recreate responsibly.
Thanks, Abby. Another question that's come up in a couple different forms in the Q&A is that a lot of park and protected area managers manage for a variety of different settings, and most of them have one or two different trails or locations that get heavily used, and they might just not have the physical capacity to accommodate the amount of use that that particular area is seeing. Has there been any successful examples, or can you provide any guidance for folks who realize that people are going to be coming to want to hike that specific trail, and the persuasive messages or tools that managers can put in place to direct folks to a plan B trail that might offer similar experiences and not cause this problem that Chris talked about, where people are just basically buying their time driving around until they can find a parking spot? And are there any solutions or ways that park and protected area managers have tried to characterize or advertise these alternative recreation opportunities that are not the prime destination for a particular park or a forest?
Yeah, and I'll let Chris and Ashley jump in if they have any other examples that they can think of as well. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of a specific example, and I think many folks in attendance today probably have specific examples that they can think of, but I know that many parks and protected areas are advertising different locations for visitors to potentially recreate in that would help relieve a burden of congestion at like a very popular site. But as you do that, as Chris talked about during his presentation, you run the risk of flooding those places with increased visitation in a short period of time, and seeing just an increase in overall impact to a protected area, because you already have this really popular area that's been impacted, and now you have other areas that are being impacted as people try to disperse as well. Chris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, Jordan, yeah, that's a very complicated question. And it's, obviously the one that's on our minds front and center these days. There's again, no one simple solution. Beginning in Rocky Mountain National Park, what we found there is that visitors were willing to go to another location and linger for a while, but ultimately they wanted to get back into the destination that they had in mind, which is in that case, Bear Lake, the Bear Lake Road. So it's complicated. Are there substitutable experiences? I think that's a good question, and that's going to be very site specific. Are those substitutable experiences in locations, or can they be made into locations that can handle additional capacities? That's kind of a physical infrastructure kind of question, and has to deal a lot with that specific environment. And then finally, what is the level of visitor compliance and interest in that? I think as much as we can engage people both before their visit, so they understand what conditions are likely to be, and during their visit in real time to be able to inform them of what current conditions are and what some alternative experiences might be, is all we can do. And we're still likely to be dealing with capacity issues at specific sites where we'll have to turn people away.
Well, thanks, Chris. And I appreciate the time that you guys put into preparing for this discussion today. And one of the things that we did talk about amongst the panelists was that really what we were trying to do today was cram down and synthesize an entire curriculum of recreation ecology knowledge and literature into 90 minutes. And I know we're a little bit over time, but I just want to say thanks to Chris, Abby, and Ashley. I did put the link to the YouTube video for the part 1 of this series if you want to check that out. We will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording for this presentation. And it looks like we have also some requests for emails from Abby, Ashley, and Chris. You can find those on our respective academic institutions' websites. And if you can't get those, let Lael or I know, and we'll make sure that you get them. So Chris, Abby, and Ashley, thanks again for sharing your insights today. And I think that there was a lot of value, a lot of good questions that came out of it.